today we're talking about drugs and about the drug trade around the world, and particularly about Mexico and Latin America and the effect of the drug trade in Mexico and Latin America. So first of all, who here is from Mexico or from Latin America? Jorge over there from? Where are you from in Mexico? From Puebla? Anybody else from Mexico or Latin America? Who here has been to Mexico or Latin America? It's a well-traveled crowd. Who here has taken illegal drugs that have come from Mexico and Latin America? Because we've got cameras out there filming all of you. I've been mistaken. I say it in a joking way, but this is an important part of the issue. The idea of local to global. So one thing you see locally, you see drugs, and it becomes a global issue. And so my first contact with drugs was way before I became a journalist. I'm a journalist now, or as the president says, a member of the opposition party. I first came into contact with drugs when I grew up in England. I grew up in Brighton, England. Anyone here been to Brighton? Good. Impressed, glad to see that. I like to be in Brighton Beach, New York as well. But anyway, I grew up in Brighton. There was a lot of drug taking when I grew up in the 1980s. I'm sure many of you have grown up in environments with a lot of drugs around. When I was growing up, a lot of my friends, a lot of kids around me, a lot of people were doing drugs, including hashish, later heroin, ecstasy, cocaine, and different drugs. And I had 4 friends who died of heroin overdoses. This is back in the 80s and early 1990s. But for us, it was a very local issue. We saw, you didn't think about where that heroin came from. It was local. We didn't think about the global issue. But drugs are an issue which really do bring many local communities together and local people together in this situation. So right now, people here in Arizona who are taking heroin or crystal meth or marijuana or cocaine, that has a direct effect on what is happening in Mexico and what is happening in Colombia and what is happening in Honduras. But growing up, we just saw these stories, we saw these people and these friends on a local level, at an individual level, taking drugs, and in some cases, dying of drug overdoses, in most cases, going on to live their lives. Then I moved to Mexico in the year 2000 to be a journalist in Mexico. And right then, I had a bit of a romantic idea that I'd be running around with left-wing guerrillas fighting military dictatorships. I'd seen the movie Salvador by Oliver Stone from the 1980s. Has anyone seen that movie? Mm-hmm. Salvador? It's kind of an old movie now, but I had a bit of a romantic idea of the James Woods character following the guerrillas in El Salvador. And I arrived in Latin America, in Mexico, at a very different moment in history. Most of the left-wing guerrillas had given up their guns and gone into politics in some cases. The president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, at one point was a left-wing guerrilla back in the 1970s. And most of the right-wing dictatorships had ended in Latin America. And you had democracies, including in Mexico, where before you'd had one party in power for 71 years, you had Vicente Fox, this Democrat, starting this new era of democracy. There was a lot of hope and a lot of optimism that this would be good times. But some things went wrong, and part of that was this issue of drugs and drug cartels. Now, right when I got to Mexico, you had these drug cartels in the background. And coming from a country and from a community with very high drug use, I was fascinated by this link between people where I grew up taking drugs and the people in Mexico and Latin America who were making and trafficking drugs. It was linked together. And also, there was this riddle, this mystery of these drug traffickers, who were these amazing figures you would hear about in songs, who were supposedly making billions of dollars, but the DEA, the Mexican army, could not catch them. So I was like mystified as to who these people were, and began covering this story, which took me on a journey over years and years of covering drug cartels. I never thought in my life, but it became my life as I got into this. So I realized to understand this phenomenon, we needed to talk to the people involved. And so gradually I got to know and got involved to know people involved in drug cartels. Particularly the sicarios, the hitmen. And you'd find often when I approached these people that had a similar profile, you'd often have these young men, massively, there's some women, but often young men, who are trained and paid to kill. You know, these people are not born murderers, but in a certain time of their life, when often they're 11 or 12 years old, often from poor neighborhoods, poor villages or poor barrios in the cities, the drug cartel will approach them. And first it will say to these kids, I'm going to give you a cell phone, I'm going to give you $50 a week, and you're going to phone me every time you see a car come past with the police, or some weird guy coming into our area, and you're going to be a spy for us. And after that job, they go on to become trained killers. Now again, this is not a thing that happens overnight. These are many young people who are trained into these paramilitary organizations. An example of one story, a guy interviewed in Colombia, in Medellin, Colombia, who became a hitman for the Medellin cartel. So again, a similar story, he'd been with the cartel from about 12 years old, and he had a mentor who was his mentor teaching him how to commit murder. And it was this type of murders where you go on the back of a motorcycle and go up to someone and fire into them. And the first time when he was 18 years old, he carried out his first hit. It was like graduation. It's like people graduate from high school. This kid was graduating to become an assassin. So he was on the back of his motorcycle, and they went up to their target, who they called La Niña, meaning the girl, not because she's a girl, it's how they call their assassination targets, La Niña. They went up, and he was nervous, it was his first time to kill somebody. He got too close, and he fired, and the blood and guts exploded over him. And he got back, and he had to get rid of his clothes and wash his clothes. And he said he had nightmares that night seeing the guy explode in front of him. But he went on again to commit a second murder, and this time he held his breath and kept his distance and fired, and didn't get the blood and guts over him, and then he killed again and again. And then he told me it got to the point where he would go out and commit a murder, he would go home, he would smoke some weed and play video games. It got that ordinary to him. So when you start to look at the sheer number of murders that are happening in Latin America and the Caribbean right now, you have to understand these systems of killing, and that people are not simply killing out of anger, like not simply a situation where you're in a bar and somebody looks at you and you react. They're machines of murder, death squads. Now, if we look at the big sheer numbers of killing, in Mexico, over a 10-year period, many of you might have heard these numbers, it's believed there's more than 100,000 murders from drug cartels or the security forces fighting the drug cartels. But across the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean over a 10-year period, it's more than 1 million murders. So to understand the sheer tragedy, the Holocaust, of what a lot of this organised violence is leading to. But all of those stories, all of those numbers mean very little compared to the individual stories of what these murders mean. And among many stories, one that really strikes out to me is a mother in Monterrey, in Mexico, who had a very traumatic story with her family. Now, she was in Monterrey, Mexico, when it became very violent, and there was many of these armed paramilitary groups of sicarios, of assassins, operating in the city, on both sides, fighting over the profits of the drug trade. And she was in her home. She was a school teacher, and she had 2 children. Her eldest son was 18 and was in his first year of studying philosophy. Her second son was 15 years old in high school. And she was sitting in her house with her 2 sons, passing the evening on a Saturday night, when suddenly the door cracked open and 15 guys came into her home carrying long guns, carrying AK-47s, bulletproof vests. A lot of these sicarios, they look more like military, paramilitary style people. So they stormed into their home, and this is what happens when you get these killers, these hit squads operating in these cities. They don't just hurt each other, they will also hurt the civilian population. So they storm into a home and they tie up the family and start just taking things from the house. Because these guys are like, okay, let's just go and take stuff from this house. And they take some stuff and then they say to her, which of your sons is the eldest? And she looks at them and she can't answer the question. She can't speak. Why are they asking me that question? What do they want? So she just can't answer. And the eldest kid, whose name was Roy, doesn't want his younger brother to suffer whatever might await. So he raises his hand and says, I'm the eldest. You know, I make him the eldest. A first year philosophy student. And they say, he's coming with us. They take him away and take him out of the house. And the next day she gets a phone call and they say, we've got your son. If you pay us a sum of money, we'll return your son to you. So like any mother in this situation, all she can think about is getting the money to pay him, to pay for his release. She calls family, she calls friends, she gets the money they ask for. She goes to a place where they're waiting and hands the money and says, yeah, your son will be released in this location in a couple of hours. He doesn't. She goes there, he doesn't appear. She phones the number, there's no reply. The next day again, there's no reply. And that was the last she saw of her son. When I met her, it was outside a morgue in Monterrey, when there had been a massacre of 49 people who had their heads cut off, their hands cut off, and their feet cut off. And she arrived to see if her son might be among these victims. She didn't know what had happened, if he'd been recruited as a hitman, if he'd somehow been used in some way. And that not knowing can be more painful, the lack of closure, which always stays with you. The look of pain in her face and not knowing what had happened to her eldest son. Now, interestingly, back in the 20th century, many of these right-wing dictatorships, which I thought we might be covering, would use the tactic of forced disappearance that now these paramilitary cartels are using. But to add to this problem and this violent situation, many of the security forces trying to fight them, or being told to fight them, are also carrying out torture and disappearances. So many people are stuck in this middle ground between them. So a lot of my work, whereas at the beginning of the time I've been in Mexico, it had been this romantic idea of who these drug cartels were, it began to find ourselves as journalists covering a humanitarian tragedy. I didn't realise I'd be turning up at places with 49 corpses. going to fields with 193 bodies. So to try and make more sense of this, as well as interviewing the members of these organizations, I also talked to other people right across the board to say what is happening in Mexico, in Honduras, in El Salvador. How is so much violence possible, and what is driving it, and what can we do to try and stop this violence? And one guy I talked to helped me make a lot of sense of it and said, this, because it feels like a war in some sense. You have these massacres. There's been single battles with 500 hitmen facing off 2,000 police. Now, how can crime lead to this? But at the same time, it does not make sense as a regular war. So there's one guy I was talking to who's actually an academic analyst on conflict. And he said, this is a place between crime and war. If you have war here and crime here, it's a place in between. A new type of violence, of armed conflict we're dealing with in the 21st century. And I think if we're talking again about global here, we've got a local and we have the global. In a global sense, this type of violence, this type of conflict is one of the big types of violence in the 21st century. Another thing, like this, seeing this mix between crime and war, we have refugees. Now, again, a lot of the focus, there hasn't been the focus on what's happening in South America in the same way, or in Latin America in the same way there has been in the Middle East, even though the numbers could often be higher in these places. But also, a lot of people are not aware of the number of people fleeing violence and applying for refugee status in the United States, not because they're fleeing violence in the Middle East, but because they're fleeing violence in the Americas. The number went up sevenfold, and in one year there was 35,000 applications from Mexico. People fleeing violence there. And many applications from El Salvador, from Honduras, from Guatemala. We had very similar situations. Most of the applications are turned down. Do you remember the child migrant crisis in 2014? There was a lot of talk about the border. So you had a situation where many of these kids had come up with very credible stories of 15, 16, 17-year-old kids with very credible stories that they had their life threatened by these paramilitary-style groups, gangs, or by the security forces fighting them, and had come up for that reason. The United Nations Refugee Agency did interviews and found the majority, it believed, would have a credible argument to qualify as refugees. But the courts here would overwhelmingly turn down those cases for several reasons. One reason, because again, these are very confused conflicts. So they're not the traditional conflicts, and a lot of the laws we have are based on the conflicts of the 20th century. And these are strange conflicts where you might have armed groups and they're not recognised as wars. But the second reason, which an immigration lawyer said to me, that they're very worried about opening the floodgates if they give refugee status to Mexicans and Central Americans. So for that reason, they're very hard. Only about 2% of asylum cases, seekers, win that refugee status. Another thing happening, which fits into a theme we've seen in this conference, is that in Mexico and in Latin American parts, you've got people taking up guns themselves to defend themselves. Has anybody here seen the movie Cartel Land? Known in Spanish as Tierra de Carteles. You seen that movie? That was a movie, a documentary made by some friends of mine, filmed in Michoacán, Mexico, and it shows people led by a doctor, a medical doctor, who take up guns themselves to fight the cartels. Now, when this started happening, you had this explosion of rising up, people rising up. And when it first started happening, I was, in a way, it seemed inspiring. I remember going to a town when they formed a militia. And these guys, they went into the town and said, everybody come out in the square here. We want you to stand up and to form a militia to fight the cartels. These cartels are killing us. These cartels are extorting. They're kidnapping. We cannot take this. The state is not defending us. We're going to take up guns to defend ourselves. And eventually these guys stepped forward. It reminded me of a scene from the movie Patriot, or as you say, Patriot, the movie where they formed a militia to fight the British. Reminded me a bit of the scene, people standing up to fight. And it became quite an inspiring story. But then you started to see cracks appearing in this. And these same guys who had formed to take up guns to fight the cartel and were effectively pushing the cartel out of towns. A lot of them were very suspect. So you'd be driving around these places and a bunch of guys would stop your car and they'd have AK-47s and start searching you and you weren't really sure who they were. Are they the good guys or bad guys? And then you'd see these guys take away a 17-year-old girl, an 18-year-old girl, so we're going to question her. Now, where are they taking her? Or they take them into buildings. In the film Cartel Land's a very good scene where they film in an installation, you can hear the screams of people they're questioning. And people disappear in their hands. So again, you start to get another armed group. Now, again, I talk about this being a big theme of the conference here. I mean, obviously, the question of justice. How can we create justice in that sense? And I went to a very interesting talk from John about the issue of police. And now we have another discussion right now, we have a discussion upstairs about the issue of police. Which, I know right now in the United States, there's a lot of people questioning police here, questioning police violence here. But there's still a level of security for some people here which you do not have in so many countries in the world. Now, is the solution, we were talking about today, is there some solution within the community to create these systems of justice which is not about policing from above? Yeah, maybe. But that's one key part that we have to look for globally and locally to find solutions to these problems. The second thing, the second area to find any solution to this is this question of hearts and minds, I call it, hearts and minds. Now, hearts and minds was the phrase used by the American army to try and win Vietnam, to win hearts and minds of people. But it doesn't fit into a certain issue in this story of drug cartels, of the gangs, of the different people in these areas. Because if you're a young kid, and you join a cartel and are prepared to commit murder and are prepared to kill police officers, your heart is going to them and not to the state or to the wider society in that sense. And it's a real issue. The reason why you get so many recruits is that in many of these areas, the gangsters, the drug cartels can be popular. You have songs about them. You have films about them. You have people in Sinaloa state in Mexico, where Chapo Guzman is from. You have people calling them valientes, or brave ones. They call the narco-traffickers the brave ones, and they call soldiers guachos, which maybe means servant, like an old word meaning servant. So they do not like the soldiers, but like the drug traffickers. In Kingston, Jamaica, where I went to as well in researching this across the world, and across Latin America and the Caribbean. In Kingston, Jamaica, in this one ghetto called Tivoli Gardens, a big ghetto in Kingston, Jamaica, with exactly the same thing. You have these young, paid hitmen. And in this area, there's a mural in the neighborhood with a painting of a major drug trafficker whose nickname is Jim Brown. And they have Jim Brown, Don of Dons, and they have a hitman and there's a fallen soldier as community heroes. And in the same community, they have the names of people who have been killed by police officers. So the hearts and minds are often won by the gangs. People have more loyalty to the gangs than to another institution. And often because the society has forgotten about these areas. Where you go to these areas where there are no paved roads, where the electricity is not working a lot of the time, where the water is not working, where there are not companies coming there to offer them employment. So people, the cartels are the ones offering something and trying to hand something to these people. Now one thing, so part of the solution I think of trying to stop this violence is you have to have people who reach out to the communities. And there are some amazing social workers I met and followed in a bunch of countries, from Ciudad Juarez in Mexico to Kingston, Jamaica, to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, but people who really go and work and reach these kids, but they do not give the real support, and to try and change the reality of these areas. There are interesting projects with people, so we want to transform. That's why I was interested right now in a talk about transforming space, because one thing is, how do you transform urban spaces? Now, whereas this is in Latin America and the Caribbean, we see some of these same factors in the United States, some of these same factors in Europe of excluded parts of the community and people who are outside the wider society. They look to these gangster warlords as giving them something. The United Nations estimates the drug trade is worth internationally about $300 billion a year. No one knows the exact numbers, but it's an illegal trade. That's a reasonable number. The White House puts out a survey every year, and they estimate the Americans spend about $100 billion every year on heroin, marijuana, crystal meth, and on cocaine. Now that money much of that money is going towards these organizations, is paying for that violence, is training these young kids, these children to be killers, is paying for those police to be corrupt and destroying the justice system in these countries. But right now, we're at a very interesting time. And look at the history of the drug trade. We see that drug policy was often formed by for racist reasons. It was formed at the beginning of the drug law in the United States. It was about making opium illegal because they were scared of Chinese men raping white women. And this is the things you can read in the literature. Scared about how cocaine would make African Americans more violent. This is one of the things you can find in the older stories. So many of those racist reasons that form drug policy, and irrational reasons. Everyone's heard the story about LSD, about the guy who went crazy with LSD, thought he could fly and jumped out the window. Stories that are irrational, they're not real stories about these things, but often the treatment of drugs has been very irrational. But now we have a chance, as a human society, as a global society, to reshape drug policy. Now we have a moment in history where people are questioning drug policy right across the board. So on the left, on the right, in the centre, people are questioning our assumptions about drug policy. So if we were trying to make a new drug policy, we can make a new drug policy to change things and try and stop that $300 billion go to these cartels. What would it be? So to get a sense now, who here, raise your hand if you believe in the legalization of marijuana. Yeah. So that's a pretty a wide number. So I feel in so many ways that debate has been won. I mean, there's still some time to go. But we also have the issue of cocaine, heroin, and crystal meth. So who here believes, for example, in some kind of legalization or regulation of cocaine? That's one of the highest numbers of any groups I've ever talked to, but I guess it's a progressive crowd here. Still a bit of a tricky issue for me, the issue of cocaine, of harder drugs. I'm still, myself, trying to see this. I mean, I think, but what I do think is right now, we're in a historic moment of change. There's a momentum for change in drug policy. We're seeing the end of actually arresting people for possession, and we have to carry on pushing the momentum through and looking for things. I hope we'll be changing drug policy with other changes. This situation can transform. And if we talk about this issue in 10 years' time, in the local to global of 2027, we won't be talking about 1 million more people murdered in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Well, thank you once again, Ioan. Having read the book, before, of course, they were kind enough to provide me with a copy previously, and having heard you, speak right now, one of the threads that I see, especially, although we do have more security here in the U.S., I think one of the major connections between what we see in Latin America and also in the U.S., if we're dealing with mass incarceration, which includes a lot of low, non-violent level offenders, or oftentimes those crimes are connected to their addictions. One of the threads that I saw there is how the populace, or the citizenry if you prefer, is caught in between gangster networks and then the government. So whether it's a quote-unquote strong government with strong presence and strong institutions, or the lack thereof, as we see in many Latin American countries, we have the populace caught in between both of those. And then one of the many things I liked about the conclusion of your book, where you discuss hearts and minds, and also what you just shared with us right now, is that oftentimes that demands a very localized form of justice, where the communities decide what works best for them. But of course, there is that complicated dynamic of how do you negotiate between the government and then the gangsters, and then how does the government perhaps reconciliate with the gangsters, because for political purposes they may not want to be seen as making these concessions. But the way I look at it historically is that if they could do it if various governments can do it with various dictators or war criminals or Nazis or Confederates, then why can't it do it with large segments of its populace who have been perhaps massively incarcerated, or even more trouble than those who are struggling to deal with their own tribulations with substance abuse. So what I was thinking was more along the lines is rather having a discussion about legalization, which is oftentimes tied to morality, which further complicates it and makes it polemical, is to have a discussion of decriminalization. Because I think that allows for a more fruitful conversation. But again, that would have to come from a highly local perspective, where the communities demand that of their governments. The other one I wanted to perhaps talk about was the reintegration and the reconciliation with addicts, with gangsters, with former prisoners. And there is another part of the book, and I know it was a common thread amongst many of the people that you interviewed, because you did title it Gangster Warlords, is the high levels of education, or in this case, self-education that many of them had. And there's a quote in there where you're discussing, it's not about who can hit hardest, but also who can think. They end up rising to the top of these organizations. But I have to say that one of my favorite sentences and then we'll open it up for questions. On page 232, you were discussing the Mara model. And this is a quote here: "It feeds on broken families, poverty, and hopelessness. It makes sense to scatter children in soulless slums who feel loyalty to no government or country, but will pledge their lives to the Mara Salvatrucha." And I believe that gets to the heart, really, of hearts and minds, where that doesn't have necessarily a legislative solution, nor even a militarized solution, which I think if we can look at it from that perspective, it further opens up greater conversations for for localized and globalized justice. But who would, but yes, we'll allow you to respond, and then I'm sure they have some questions.
Okay, please. Thanks for those great questions and that feedback. So in terms of the second thing first, about the question of redemption and rehabilitation, I think it's important, it's difficult. Some of these people I interviewed and met have committed many, many murders. Not one or two, we're talking about, can be over 50 murders. People who have carried out war crimes effectively. People, I tried myself to get into who they were, to see them as people. I mean, you know, and so I'm interviewing somebody and I'm trying to keep a level as a journalist, a gravity. And they've described decapitating people while they were still alive. They've described doing very horrific things. And I'm trying to see what it's like to be in their head. You know, what's it? You know, what could it be like to be them? For some of them, it's very hard. I mean, is there really a rehabilitation? Should they really be? You know, what can you do if someone's committed war crimes? That amount of death. I mean, what is justice in that situation? That's kind of a harder philosophical question. So in some cases, you know, you really need to reach the people earlier to stop the kids getting into this, to reach them at 12 or 10, to really help them with social programs. There are some things, you know, where they, and in Colombia, they did try to start applying to some drug cartels, similar programs to what they'd applied with guerrillas or paramilitaries, saying we can try and make some kind of deal to reintegrate you into society. You know, and sometimes there's guys on the street who have no other option at that point. They're scared to leave the cartel because they'll be killed for that. They're scared to get back into society, so they've got no way of disarming. So sometimes some kind of techniques that have been applied in war zones where you're looking for peace, and sometimes to find peace you need a certain level of forgiveness, forgive peace, can be applied. But it's tough, and I think it gets back to this central issue of this mix of crime and war, so people can't work out how to deal with it. To the point about decriminalisation, so like I say, we're in a momentum of drug policy reform right now. In Portugal, they effectively decriminalised possession of drugs, of all drugs. And I think it was effective. I believe in that, especially in the context of the United States. There's no point in incarcerating people for possessing and for using drugs. I believe in that. Yeah, there's some good claps there. I believe in that. However, that does not in itself solve the problem of the black market. You could have drugs decriminalised for everybody, but still have the 300 billion going in, because it's still, if the business side is handled by drug cartels, by organised crime, you still have that side. We have some questions. Okay, guns and ammo. Okay, very good question, because it relates very much to right here. Many of the guns are coming from not only the United States, but from Arizona. Arizona is one of the biggest suppliers of guns to Mexican cartels. I came here, the second time I came here, I was in the ATF offices here in Phoenix, Arizona, and saw the stash of guns they had seized from guns that were being bought by people, many headed down to Mexico, and they had huge amounts. One agent said that in a week here he saw more guns seized than 10 years working in New York. They're among the guns, not only can you buy obviously the AK-47s in the shops here, and the AR-15s, which they take to Mexico and they convert. So they put these circular clips, which in Mexico they call huevos, circular clips, with 100 bullets. So you go to these crime scenes where they've sprayed 100 bullets, or you've had 3 or 4 sicarios who've sprayed 500 bullets, and they've not only killed their victims, they've killed the guy selling tacos on the side of the street, or the woman in the car behind. As well as that, in the shops here, they have people selling guns that fire .50 caliber bullets. They showed me a video of some guys. They found the video of some guys who bought a gun and were testing it here in the Arizona desert, testing the gun. They had the video, but the gun and the guys were back in Mexico. And when they fight with the military, they can often open fire with these things. So these are warlike weapons. And Mexican president after Mexican president came here and said, you've got to try and stop guns. Now, I went to the press conference when Barack Obama went to Mexico in 2009. And he was asked, what about the guns issue? And he said, I would like to try and stop his gun sales, but I can't. Which was an honest answer, I guess, that he felt that he politically could not. So one of the main sources in the United States, there's also another source, also guns come from, like you have grenades, RPG-7s, stolen from the militaries in Central America. There was a scene in Mexico where some of these guys had what's called an RPG-7, it's a shoulder, thing you have in your shoulder, and you fire a rocket. And it was likely stolen from the military in Honduras. But these are militaries that are getting armed up by governments, and even some grenades from El Salvador that were given to the Salvadoreño government back in the 1980s for them to fight the leftist guerrillas back in the 80s, go back to Salvador again. So these circles going around there of weapons. More questions? Are the people of power in control of everything? Or are they just fucked up or cocking up in a lot of what they're doing? Or sometimes, did they have a conspiracy and did that conspiracy go wrong? Like in the Middle East right now. Is it really how they want it, or did they try and have a conspiracy for something else and it went wrong? But don't look at the drug trade and look at this drug war. I don't believe personally it was as the way things, like the people in power deliberately decided they want things this way. But I totally agree, there's many vested interests, as you pointed out.
Follow the money.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree, many vested interests, money, pushing this thing. But if you look at, and like you said exactly, I mean, banks, a big case with HSBC Bank, taking loads of drug money. I know somebody working at HSBC talking about exactly how they were just when guys turn up at the bank with a suitcase full of cash, it's like, okay, put it in. So that money comes out in service. Now, I mean, there's many cases like this. There was some of these cartels doing mass kidnappings in Mexico. And we're getting, of Central Americans, the cartels were kidnapping Central Americans coming through Mexico and getting their family here to send money to them, to release them. And the money was going through Western Union. So Western Union was taking commission on kidnappings, effectively. And if you get like 50 payments sent to one guy picking up for a bunch of prisoners they had there. Like you say, the gun sale, the bureaucracy of the DEA, which gets $2.3 billion a year. That's all people's money, agency. Getting money from drug traffickers. There are many motives, but also there's a lot of conflicting forces here. So you have, on one side you have people with motives of making money. On the other side you can say to people, well look, if you're destabilizing countries, if countries are being destabilized, that's where you're going to get more refugees. Nicaragua is poorer than many of the countries in this region, but it has way less violence and way less people leaving Nicaragua to come here. So motives like that, so what are motives? To convince people that there are other things, other factors that more peaceful solutions could give you. Yeah, thanks. Other questions? Yeah, exactly. So if you legalise marijuana, for example, they're losing that money. What are they going to do to make up for that loss of money? And I got this question. I was talking in Guadalajara one time, and a guy said, look, I know the guys, I know a lot of these guys from the Sinaloa cartel, growing marijuana, they're good people. What are you going to do if you legalise marijuana? He asked me the same question. Legalizing marijuana is already hitting cartels. I believe that's a good thing. If you take marijuana away from them, you take oxygen or the blood which supports these organizations and makes it into a legal business. Now, people can look at some arguments like people would turn more to kidnapping or extortion or more violent crimes. But you actually, if you look at some of the places in the long term, there's countries with extremely high rates of drug trafficking, also with massive amounts of kidnapping, extortion at the same time. Happened in Colombia, happened in Mexico. Because you create organizations which make loads of money with drugs, buy off loads of police, have loads of guns, the situation's very chaotic, and they commit other antisocial crimes at the same time. When you have places with less drugs, money, they're often more peaceful, and you can see that in Latin American countries. So I think in the long term, by taking away the big drug profits, you would make other criminal activities more manageable. There are questions? So in Nicaragua, you had the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Have you been to Nicaragua?
Yes, twice.
Recently or in the days of the...
Sandinista period and then post-Sandinista period
okay. Well, look, I mean, I'm sure you know a lot. That was what I would have loved to have seen. Historically, what was happening in the 1980s, and I'm sure you've got a lot of your own experience. But I think one of the arguments that is raised about that is that the Sandinistas built a security apparatus to fight the Contras. So they had inside their neighborhoods a lot of people who were informants or working with the Sandinista security services or militant activists who were sympathetic, who would say, okay, we've got information the Contras are here. And, in some ways a repressive apparatus, in other ways a community-based apparatus, depending on your perspective. But part of that same apparatus has been effective against the incursion of gangs and organised crime. So these guys have got, rather than the neighbourhoods which are just completely left away from the state, they have got a presence. Now Cuba, which is, I believe Cuba, overall it's a dictatorship, Cuba, and I don't support dictatorships, but Cuba is one of the most peaceful places in Latin America. And in Cuba you can walk around and not be concerned. On the other hand, Venezuela is a very violent country, despite emulating this idea of a socialist revolution on a kind of Cuban, Nicaraguan style model. So that answers your question, but I think there's a big factor was the Sandinista apparatus and the Sandinista security apparatus. Questions? So basically, it's a good point. As a journalist, you go in and you interview a mass murderer who describes crimes. You go to a morgue and see bodies with their heads cut off and their hands and feet cut off. You go to situations that are scary where people are pointing guns at you. How do you deal with that? There's a certain separation you do as a journalist, which you have a separation. You find a centre of gravity. So it's not quite the same as you're experiencing these things in your personal life. It is in your life, but they're not in, totally around your house. You're going to a place and you're doing a job as a journalist and trying to create a separation and an emotional level. You've got to do your job and you've got to report on these things. So you're no good if you're a wreck. You have to try and keep. However, there are journalists and there are definitely cases of trauma. There are journalists I know who have been in more conflict than me, who I think do suffer from post-traumatic stress and can have a lot of stress mentally from what they've seen in terms of violence. And I do believe, yeah, you do have to be aware sometimes when you see very horrific things. I mean, when I used to see a lot of dead bodies on the streets covering cartels, I used to have nightmares about, you see those bodies, and you get used to it as well. Like in the movies, when people see dead bodies, in the movies they like throw up straight away. Whereas in real life, I mean, you get these crime scenes and everyone's taking photographs of the bodies, and it becomes very normal, sadly. You get customized. I have a story today in the New York Times about the violence against journalists in Mexico. Last year, Mexico had more journalists murdered. It was the third most murderous country after Syria and Afghanistan. So the only one outside was supposedly declared war zone. It's been more than 100 in the time, more than 100 journalists have been killed in the time that I've been in Mexico. I said in the story, talking about being accustomed, we can't be accustomed to that killing. It wasn't making news. And I think it was at the time, one of the reasons the New York Times would like to publish it today was because when the American media start to feel very under attack, they also, so you can show some solidarity and feel some solidarity. So, okay, we're under attack right now from a president who's attacking us, but look over the border, look at our journalistic colleagues over the border and what they're facing. In terms of how it plays out day to day, there are, apart from sometimes the issue of physical violence against us in the field, against reporters in the field, it's a difficult thing which we're always learning, we're always trying to understand. Can we go to a certain place at a certain time? What are the movements of the armed groups in that place? You work out protocols. Generally, like if I'm, which are the more dangerous places and how you can go there. So, for example, Tamaulipas state is one of the most violent and scary in Mexico to work in. I would almost always be with local journalists, with contacts locally, sometimes with local police. Although the police are corrupt, with local police because they at least have some kind of power there locally. And sometimes in many of these places I've been to, you'll go there with the gangsters. Now, when, say for example in Brazil or in Jamaica, when I've been in these ghetto areas and I've been interviewing gangsters, they're giving you a level of protection. Other guys are, who's that guy? But they're not going to mess with you because you're with them, and they really are the law in the area. Now in Brazil it was particularly surreal. I went to what's called a favela in Brazil called Antares, and the guys were very, very openly carrying heavy guns, grenade launchers. I went to a party there with music called funk music, which is more like electronic music. And I went up and we went up and asked them, they were just coming here, I'm a journalist, we're not going to take photographs, I'm just going to here to look and to see what's going on. And the guy was like, okay, fine. That's fine, could you come down here, could you come in here? But because they were the ones guaranteeing our protection in that area, but it's a constantly tough thing to juggle. In terms of the issue of being a foreigner versus being a Mexican, there's many great Mexican journalists who are reporting on these issues on a national level and on a local level. There's Mexican journalists from Mexico City or from Monterrey, people like Diego Osorno, Alejandra Almazan, Sandra Nieto, like many great journalists who are going down doing this different, writing books and reporting the story for the national Mexican and international audience, as well as many great Mexican journalists going to other conflicts around the world. I mean, Ioan Carlos, who has the cover of Gangster Warlords, actually, so he's a Salvadoran journalist, but he also recently was in Mosul taking photographs of that conflict. He also an interchange there. In terms of the issues, what's really hit particularly the journalists in Mexico is the fact people are living in small towns or cities next to these guys. So you go into, for example, Apatzingán, Michoacán, where I was threatened in Apatzingán, Michoacán. But I went there, I was threatened there by some guys, some heavily armed guys there, and I left. So these guys who live in that particular small town, they get that threat, and then you're going to the superstore, you're at the supermarket, the shopping mall and you see the same guys who threatened you there. You know, you're living very close to those guys, and they know they're particularly vulnerable in those areas. When you are with somebody, and if they're protecting your life at that moment, you have a certain bias towards them. So, like, if I'm in Jamaica and I'm interviewing gangsters in Jamaica who are telling me their stories, then when I write up, I kind of tell their story to an extent. Now, the way I see this is, as a journalist, we've got no godly powers of that we have a certain vision. All we can do is go there, find these interviews, find information, make our comments about it, and say this is what it is. So if I interview an assassin, say this is his story. Okay, so I'm looking at something like, he was born in this place, he grew up here, this is the story that he told me. This is what I can corroborate here. Prison records, this is, you know, these people, and then I go and talk to a police officer and tell his story. So, for example, in Brazil, I went with a very hardcore police officer in Brazil, a guy who'd been in hundreds or maybe thousands of firefights. He was looked like a wrestler, and when I was interviewing him, he mentioned that he had a bullet stuck in the back of his head. He had a bullet half embedded in the back of his head. So, like, you know, I think you have to understand, you know, often when you are with people, you'll be sympathetic to them sometimes. But these are the stories you're going to tell, but we need to find that truth. To find that truth still, we need to hear their stories. So with the media, I'm a freelance journalist. I'm independent. I've worked before for news organisations. I worked for Reuters full-time. I work with various newspapers. I like being freelance to have my independence and to try and be an independent thinker. Now, sometimes editors will push a line not from a political perspective, just because that's what makes sense to sell the story. The motive sometimes is not even a political bias, but simply they want to make a story sell. So that's a bias we have implicitly. Sometimes, what they think, what you think is important. In most cases, I haven't had a conflict, a really hard conflict of conscience over, like, I remember over a story where I've really said to my editors, have said, this is the political line. I mean, I thought, in terms of, the thing about reporting on crime, it's confusing ideologically. It's not a simple issue of like left against right. This is like a very complicated issue which really both the left and right have to come together to try and find solutions for. But when you have more political stories, I mean, like right now, where you can cover a story very polarised politically. But overall, I've generally fought for telling the story how I want to tell it. I mean, sometimes you're going to get interviews cut and so forth, but I don't feel I've had a political stance imposed upon me. So do I think that they're doing enough to protect their people? Yeah, no. I mean, no, absolutely not. I mean, it's been a failure of government to protect their people, massively. One of the guys, there was one guy, and interestingly in Mexico, and there's been various attempts by different governments and so forth, but overall it's been a failure of government to protect their people. It was very interesting in Mexico, there haven't been that many politicians who have really been able to say, to come and protect their people. And one of the guys, interestingly, some of the guys who came forward offering some protection were priests. So there was various priests who would come forward and offer some things to protect people, and one of them would give mass in a bulletproof jacket. So there are so many threats from the cartel. It's called Padre Goyo. And he would sit there and he would say, we have to stand up, we have to fight the cartel, we have to unify together. And it struck me as weird how this failure of the political system, that the politicians are not the ones, they're not really up there doing this, But I think, that for various reasons of corruption and inefficiency, there's been overall a massive failure of government to protect people against this violence. The Trump stance on Mexico has obviously been terrible for a bunch of reasons, unrelated to drug cartels. I mean, the fact that Trump is saying Mexico has to pay for a border wall in the United States is crazy. I mean, what is the argument? How can you force a country to pay for a wall here? It's a case of extortion. The fact that he had, which was totally off the wall, that the Trump administration said they're going to deport people who are not Mexican into Mexico. I mean, that is crazy. How can you grab somebody who's from Haiti or El Salvador and throw them in Mexico? It's like if in England they started grabbing people and throwing them in France. I mean, it's completely crazy stuff. So for a bunch of reasons, his position on Mexico, the way he's been threatening and through tweets, all of it has been horrific. Specifically about drug cartels. Now, I guess it's an important issue. Some of Trump will use this issue of what I'm reporting in Mexico, what I'm reporting in Latin America, say, oh, these are the bad dudes, or the bad hombres. Very, very deceptive, that is. Because on the first side, the people that they're mixing together the issue of regular people working hard for a living and equating them with a lot of these cartels when they're very, very different things. And secondly, if he really wants to fight cartels, now he's asked with an executive order for information about cartels and organised crime in this country. I would hope his people would say, yes, they're making lots of money from the United States, they're getting lots of guns from the United States, and you can, as you raised, clamp down on that money, and as you raise, clamp down those guns. But we'll see. But anyway, to end on two scenarios. I mean, one side, this is global, this is local to global. So it's fitting to talk about drugs here because drugs are a local issue with global consequences. To solve them, we have to think globally and act locally and try and bring those together. On the other side, we're seeing a resurgence of nationalism exemplified by Trump and Bannon, talking about economic nationalism, talking about only solving national problems, attacking international institutions. So that's even stepping back from this. But to end on a positive note, I think it's always good to end these things on a positive note, rather than a negative note. You know, we've got different things and exciting things happening right now in the world. We're living in a crazy time of massive change. We're seeing the rise of resurgence of nationalist movements and so forth. But we're also seeing things like this. And we're seeing things like this where people are coming together to talk about global problems, to talk about solutions to those. And so we're in a historic time of change with drug policy. So I think despite a lot of the nationalist resurgence, despite a lot of very negative policies, there's still a lot of progress that can take place in how we really confront and change these issues, maybe from the grassroots. Okay, thank you. Thanks much to the organisers here.